Hello and welcome to The Sharpening. I am your host, Josh Peck. Would like to welcome to the show Mark Flynn. Mark, how are you doing?
Very good, Josh. Thanks for having me on.
Something that you bring up in your book is the study of mythology in the during the Middle Ages, and I mean we could even talk about that. What were the requirements needed before the study of mythology during the Middle Ages?
Well, you know, I was thinking about what the real two things would be, and that would be your family needed money first off, so they had to be part of the group of people that had the information. They also needed, access to a library that had the books, so the students could read them, and then they needed the teachers that were, able and willing to teach, and it naturally, at that time, required language skills in Greek, Hebrew, Latin, of course, and the student would have to go through a cycle of learning rather than just having it all thrown to them at one time. What was it? The first thing that they needed was grammar, and then logic and rhetoric, and then they moved on after they'd mastered those to the quadrivium, which were the 4 subjects: arithmetic, astronomy, very important, geometry, just as important, and music, which a lot of people don't realize. Music isn't really taught that much here in the United States. It used to be a little bit more, but in other countries like Japan, they teach every student how to read music. It's just something that kids learn to do. So once the quadrivium, the 4 subjects are mastered, then only if the student is deemed worthy, then he'll get a mentor and he'll move on to mythology. And how long that takes, I think, would vary. It depends on the student, and then depends on, of course, I think if the student's very worthy, then they'll get a mentor regardless of whether their family has the money to do it. But a worthy student requires a worthy mentor, and from then on, the study of mythology brings them somewhere. There's a goal of mythology, or understanding mythology, and a lot of people don't realize that there is. Freemasons, I think, definitely understand what the goal is, and I think there's another genre of people who have the knowledge that maybe wouldn't consider themselves Freemasons, but I would call them the neo-alchemists. And they keep this body of knowledge and give it to, or I guess it's more of a dissemination of it, tests for people to see if they're worthy.
So why is the the study of mythology, why is it so important to people like that? Like what was the ultimate goal of the study of mythology?
The ultimate goal would be to get to the sun, and if anybody said that really well, it was Plato in his Republic, and he talks about the cave of the philosophers, which before I try to explain it and do a very bad job at it, I have it on my blog, and it's a cartoon version with Orson Welles narrating the whole thing. It actually is a really excellent way to go and figure out what it's all about. I guess, of course, you could read the Republic. A lot of people don't have that patience. And when I say find the sun, I'm talking about intellectual illumination, knowledge, specifically that was given to mankind in the Garden of Eden. And I don't know if a lot of people make that connection. So when you're learning mythology in high school, or just sort of a cursory survey or whatever it is, and you learn about Narcissus, for example, right? You learn that this guy really liked the way he looked, and you learn that story. You learn about Arachnid, the weaver, and the contest, and how Arachnid was punished. Or, there's a lot of stories, but you just learn the stories. You don't understand what the stories mean, and the stories are almost always, every time I've looked at them with some consideration, always talking about something else, and that's something else I think I'll work in, we'll work into talking about. But it's I don't really want to use the word diabolical, but it's, I guess, more simple to just say it's about illumination. It's about opening of the eyes of man. Exactly what happened to Eve when she ate the fruit of the knowledge of the tree of good and evil. Her eyes were opened. And, by the way, that's what Europa means. Yeah, as it turns out, in the story of the cave, it's a dialogue between Socrates and a student of his named Glaucon, and that also means, it's also an idea of open eyes or wide shining eyes, like Athena has. Always the bright, the eyes it can see. The owl can see and has the big eyes. You see owls all over the place in architecture. But yeah, are you familiar with the allegory of the cave?
I watched the video on your website. And for those who may not be familiar with it, what, like a basic rundown? What's the allegory of the cave?
What Plato's talking about is the state of mankind who lives in this darkness and yet thinks that they understand the world, and so that's why he calls it the cave of the philosophers. What the story is exactly is he says, well, what if men were born in darkness in a cave and chained to a wall, even their heads being chained, and all they could see in front of them was another wall and somewhere behind them, but they didn't understand that there was anything behind them at all. There were shadows being projected on the wall that they could see. And what type of thought would go on amongst the people that were wise or capable of thinking? Well, there would be philosophers among them that saw the shapes on the walls moving, and they would say, well, I can predict what that shape will do. And that was the extent of what they knew. And he talks about, well, what if you released one of these men and actually let them come out of that portion of the cave and see that there was a fire above them and there were people walking above them on a wall casting these shadows? How would he react? Now he's made that first step, away from ignorance, and it's difficult for him. The light's bright, and what he sees is very strange. He's never seen it before. He's talking about it being difficult for us to step away from our ignorance and go towards the true light, which happens to be a bit more diabolical than people would realize. They don't realize. I mean, what he's talking about is something that I find very diabolical, but you'll see what I'm saying. Anyway, he says, continue on. Let's say that there's a path towards the outside from this cave, and the sun's out. What if a man went all the way outside and saw the sun? He'd be absolutely blinded. He's never seen anything so bright in his life. But eventually his eyes would become accustomed to the light, and he'd start seeing the whole world out there. And he'd be, of course, naturally very excited and want to go tell his friends. His brother philosophers still in the cave, and that's a problem. Once you see and once you know what's out there, what the light, what the true world, where the true information and knowledge comes from, the source of it, you go back and try to explain it to people that are chained in ignorance still. They will not accept it, and it's a labor to take them out and get them to see what you see. There's almost no way that you can ever explain to them what the sun is. You can't explain to someone that's been chained in a cave their whole life, looking at the wall at shadows. Anyway, he has another allegory that he extends from the cave, the allegory of the cave, to the allegory of the divided line. And specifically, he talks about a line that's been divided as the golden ratio. And I don't know if I should get into the golden ratio right now, but the first section, he says, is the unseen world, which is the larger section of it. It's the world outside, and then the visible world is the smaller section, the shadows on the wall. And it progresses from images to objects and belief in the objects, and then into intelligent understanding, and then to the true world and the sun. But there's another layer to this idea of the divided line, or the allegory of the divided line, and that is the golden mean, the golden section. And it's really a really important key that I found that brings a lot of the meaning out of these mythological accounts, these stories. And you see the ancient philosophers talking about mathematical constants like phi, which is the golden mean, or pi. What is phi? It's 1.618. And the way you can calculate the golden mean is by doing a number series. And the Italian mathematician, I think his name was
Fibonacci, the Fibonacci sequence.
Yes, the Fibonacci sequence. So yeah, you start the Fibonacci sequence with 0, 0, then add the next number, 1, and you get 1, then add that number to what the result is. So 1 plus 1 is 2, you get a 2, then 2 plus 1 is 3, 3 plus 2 is 5, 5 plus 3 is 8. It goes on and on like that infinitely. And as it turns out, the farther down the series, if you take the two resulting numbers and divide the lower one into the next higher one, you'll get that ratio, 1.6, fairly close, 1.61803, I think. There is another way to find out what that number is, and that is by making a golden right triangle, or using the right triangle to make a golden section. And I won't go into that, but I think the easiest thing to say about golden triangles is if you look at a regular pentagram, there are 5 golden triangles, and that's just the definition of a regular pentagram. It has 5 golden triangles. The reason that a golden triangle is important, and the golden ratio is important, is because of an idea. And maybe I shouldn't get into the idea right now, but it's very important in the sense of generating something new, something that hasn't existed before, but with the quality that the thing that generates itself. Getting back to the triangles, if you take 2 of these right triangles and put them together, I automatically start thinking of Greek architecture, and you'll see pillars, and you'll see the triangular, sort of attic above it all the time. You'll see them in government buildings. You'll definitely see them in banks. You'll see them outside of very rich people's houses. I mean, the more ornate, the better. And I'd seen them everywhere, and wondered about them. And when I wonder about something for a long time, it starts getting irritating to me. And I think there's got to be a reason why I'm seeing them everywhere, and seeing them, over and over in certain places, characteristically. You'll see them in government buildings all the time, almost exclusively. No good, expensive government building is ever put together without some type of Greek architecture. And that style, or the neoclassical or Palladian style, is something that you'll see in Washington, D.C., definitely. And they are definitely telling a story. When you go there, you know what I mean. If you've already been there, I'm sure you know what I mean. But they're not only telling a story, they're doing magic. They're doing ritual. They're doing ritual for favor of the god that they worship. So I might as well backtrack a little bit from here and go back to the Garden of Eden, which I really haven't addressed. And what I'm talking about is when the Nachash, when that angel goes to the garden that God made, the paradise that he made, where he made Adam and Eve, and his presence was with them, and told Eve that God had lied to her, that her eyes would be opened and she would be like God, be as a God herself. And when she ate that fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good, the tree of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, her eyes were opened, as it says in Genesis, and she became naked. Well, she realized she was naked, but in the Hebrew it means subtle. According to the people that I'm talking, I might as well just say who these people. They're the upper echelons of Freemasonry, and of course, they will deny it. I mean, it seems really kind of like a cliche thing to say. Well, the Freemasons worship Lucifer. No, not all of them. I would say that the people that are like lower level Masons may not realize that there are a group that's much higher than them of a different sort of mindset, but they definitely worship Lucifer. They worship the Nachash, and they also worship the first human being that did what the Nachash told her to do. And they have an opposite, or a completely 180 degree version of the story in Genesis, and that was, and Bill Cooper, who wrote Behold a Pale Horse, said the same thing that I'm saying. That is, they believe that mankind was the prisoner of God there, and God made us as an oppressor, evil God. And I think you talked a little bit about this in your last book, in Gnosticism, which I found really, Sophia, very, very fascinating. Anyway, and then Nachash went to the garden to free man. If it wasn't for the Nachash going to the garden and giving Eve the fruit, we would have had no chance at all. We'd still be prisoners there. So Eve is worshipped as well, or she's venerated, honored, as a creature that generated a new version of humanity. She did the act by listening to what the serpent told her to do, against what her creator God told her that would kill her, cause her to die. She did something that made a completely new creature, knowing good and evil. And then, of course, the effects of this were that heaven, I'd say paradise, was broken, or heaven, God's presence on earth, left. He left and cursed the snake and cursed both Adam and Eve. And they had to labor to live, and they did die. They didn't know what death was before that. They found out. But the people that worship the Nachash definitely think Eve was a great being, and they, in their minds, she is a goddess, and she is the first human being to have the knowledge that the snake, the Nachash, gave mankind. What portion of knowledge that is they think quite large. But this idea of self-generation has a word, and if you look into the Greek pantheon and you see Athena She has her Parthenon. I almost said Pantheon. I meant Parthenon, and Parthenos means self-generation or virgin, the self-born virgin. The temple of the self-born virgin is the Parthenon. And the story about Athena is that she sprung in full armor out of the head of Zeus after Prometheus, the god that stole fire, light, knowledge from Zeus. He struck Zeus in the head with a double-bladed axe, or a labrie, which released Athena with her bright eyes. And this is an allegory of the story in the Garden of Eden. The serpent is Prometheus, and the double-bladed axe is, the two-sided thing, the knowledge of good and evil, the fruit. And he struck at God himself, right? His creator, he struck at him, this is what I'm doing to what you've set up. I'm splitting you away from the earth, and I'm giving this woman knowledge that I'm going to control for the time being, and your presence is going to leave, and heaven's going to leave earth. So I've said enough about the garden now, but going back to architecture, pillars are a symbol of that act in the garden, that occurrence in the garden, where heaven got separated from the earth because of what the Nachash did. And that idea of having the golden sections above are talking about parthenogenesis. And I am not explaining the relation very well now, but the thing about parthenogenesis is there's creatures on Earth that actually do exhibit this trait, like bees, and some reptiles do. And I think the turkey does, and occasionally the chicken can have offspring without having a male around at all, with no fertilization. Like, they can have offspring. But in fact, the genealogy of the queen is the Fibonacci sequence. The bees were incredibly important in the ancient world, especially in ancient goddess worship. A lot of the priestesses to Artemis and Athena were called bee mistresses. People talk about it, but I've never gone anywhere out on the internet and read or seen in literature exactly why. Why are they called bee mistresses? What's the point? There's got to be a reason for it, and I believe, I'm quite convinced that it's the idea of self-generation. That idea of the occurrence. I mean, they're always related to the goddesses, the female gods, not the male as much, but they're all Eve goddess-like in the way that they are affiliated with these parthenogenic creatures. The queen can make a drone, but you need a drone and a queen to make another queen. So that's how that genealogy goes. And so anyway, I was talking about Athena. I was going to say that her Parthenon is aligned, and I don't know if a lot of people know this. It's aligned to a specific star cluster in the night sky.
Oh, wow.
That is in Taurus. And the star cluster's name is Hyades. And the mythology behind that is Hyades were the daughters of the personification of the pillars Atlas himself, the one who stands on the edge of the world on the earth and holds heaven. A lot of people are confused about what Atlas does. He holds the earth, he stands on the earth, and he keeps heaven and earth apart. And I won't go into the story about that. It's in Hesiod's Theogony, Origin of the Gods. But that's an interesting thing. I mean, why would her temple be aligned to that specific star cluster in Taurus? And why Taurus? I'll get into that. That is a major portion of the book. what's the bull worship all about? Why is there such a there's a fixation on the bull in ancient mythology? Zeus always turned into a bull. Why was that? Anyway, I'll get back to Athena and Neth. Athena has an equivalent in Egyptian mythology named Neth. Peculiar thing about Neth was that she wore a red headdress called a deshret, and it had a peculiar sort of appendage coming out of the center, which everybody describes as a bee proboscis. And it was red, the hat was red, and it symbolized her dominion over the red lands, the deshret, the bright lands. And the counterpart to Neth was Set, and he ruled over the Kemet, or the dark lands. And then here again, you have this allegory of light and dark. You have the Kemet, which is the land, the fertile earth lands near the Nile, and you have this dark lord, Set, ruling over it. Not necessarily dark, it's the earth. But then you have the red lands, where the sun comes and where the woman reigns, and she is somehow has something to do with bees. And she's sending the light, as Neth was said to send rays into the primordial ocean to spark life. And the idea is this light and dark coming together, this woman and darkness coming together again, becoming one. Neth specifically was a goddess of war, like Athena, hunting, weaving. Her symbol was the crossed arrows and the loom. And she usually is depicted holding an ox goad, the type of thing, a very long staff that you use to try to get your oxen to move. Another parallel between Neth and Athena was this protection that they had called the Aegis, spelled in it's the Greek, but in English it's spelled A-E-G-I-S, but I think it's pronounced Aegis. And the peculiar thing about the Aegis that Athena wore is it came from a snake. In some cases, it's a snake. In others, it's a goat or a goat-like creature. And the name of it was Pallas, P-A-L-L-A-S, Pallas. And Pallas has a lot of different identities in mythology, and how actually Athena came to wear that skin around her neck, or that shield that was made out of the skin of Pallas around her neck. But in one account, it was the Titan Pallas, the giant serpent. In other cases, Pallas was her teacher or her colleague or her friend. But in every case, Athena accidentally killed Pallas, and it's consistent usually that there was something that Zeus did to interfere with them fighting, and so Pallas was injured, and Athena took advantage of the momentary lapse of protection because of what Zeus did to Pallas, and accidentally killed her friend or teacher, and she was very remorseful. And it sounds kind of like a very strange thing if you're remorseful and sad about what you did to your great friend, that you'd skin your friend. That's where the Aegis came from, and it's a symbol that she wears, showing that she is the greatest of all warriors. She's invulnerable. As she's wearing this Aegis, there's nothing that can beat her, nothing can defeat Athena. She's the goddess of war. And there are likenesses of Neth that wear the same sort of Aegis-looking garment. It looks like an armored apron that they wear. And the peculiarity of Athena's Aegis is that she has the face of Medusa on the front. And I won't get into that story, but it's in the book, and it kind of reinforces the idea of what Zeus represents and what the bull or the ox represents as well. Yeah, as far as the Gnostics and the neo-alchemists and the upper levels of the Freemasons are concerned, they absolutely believe in the Garden of Eden event. Whereas I think there's perhaps some Christians is to say, maybe, the Christians is to say, maybe that's an allegory, or it's just a nice story, or they don't take the Bible really literally. Actually, there's a lot of Christians that are very ignorant of a lot of the things in the Bible, but or just pick which ones that they like. But that Garden of Eden story is everything.
Yeah.
To the mystics. It is absolutely the beginning of everything, and it's so absolutely important. I'm definitely convinced of that. Save for the understanding of it is completely reversed. For his great act, he was punished by God, right? He was made to crawl on his belly and eat dust, and that is the beginning of a circuit. And I'm not really sure why I was thinking that now. That's 3:14 in Genesis 3:14.
Yep.
3.14 reminds me of another mathematical constant, and I think it's appropriate that it is that chapter and verse, because it is the beginning of an idea of a circuit, because you have this paradise, you have an incursion of this angel that destroys it, and God, at that point in time, he punishes the serpent, and he also makes a prophecy. If you're looking at Genesis that way, I think I read a book by DeHaan, Portraits of Christ in Genesis, where he talks about that specific verse where he is guaranteeing a redeemer from man that will strike at the heel of the snake, or the snake would strike at man's heel, but the man would crush his head rather. And that's something that's being inverted when you're looking at the pediment. And I don't know if I talked about that, but the pediment is what that triangle, that triangular shaped roof structure is on top of the pillars.
Oh, okay.
So pediment's at the top, even though it means foot. And so you have this idea of a reversal that Nachash is saying, and I didn't complete that thought. Now, come to think of it, the Nachash is saying, I'm going to reverse the curse that you gave me, God, and I'm going to reunite heaven and earth under my plan, my will, and because I gave mankind the fruit that you told them to kill them, that act is what I'm going to use to make the world, my own. I'm going to bring it together under my will rather than your will. His defiance is displayed in every building you look at that has that structure, the pillars. You can think of it, well, this was set there because of the act in the garden. These pillars are now separating heaven and earth, and that defiant structure at the top is the Nachash saying, I still am defying you, God, and through the doors of whatever building that is, whatever that institution is, what's going on there somehow furthers that plan towards the ultimate end. Of course, we know who wins. I'm talking through, the mindset of the people that worship the serpent. They don't. I'm sure they don't understand what they're looking at, or why they even. Well, maybe I'm wrong about that, but the majority of people who go into buildings like that and work or are part of these organizations have no idea what it means when they look at it. You see them, of course, almost every capital, every county building, every courthouse. Courthouses love them. I love that type of architecture, and Masonic temples really like neoclassical. But I think they definitely understand why they're putting it there. if you go into, I've never been into a Masonic temple before. I've never walked, never set foot into one, but I've seen lots of pictures on the internet. The older ones are great. They had a lot of money. The turn of the last century, they made some really great temples. Anyway, so we're talking about Neth and the idea of joining heaven and earth again under their power, and the fact she wears an aegis like Athena. It's important to realize kind of that there's more goddesses in the ancient world that all have similar characteristics. In fact, when I was looking at all of them in depth, I found that you can make a graph and you can find various citations from ancient authors that say, well, this goddess is really this one in this culture, you know, like what's a good example? Well, I mean, what we just been talking about, they say the counterpart of the Egyptian Neth is Athena. But Athena is also related to goddesses much, much older, an Anatolian goddess. And I say Anatolian, and people don't know what I mean. Anatolia just is modern day Turkey, that area. And there's an ancient goddess, or the mother, they called the great mother goddess, that was adopted by Greece and later Rome, but it's very old, and her name was Cybele. And for a long time I wondered how her name was pronounced, and it's Cybele, and she has a very strange story. She wasn't always a female goddess. She was a male goddess. She started out as Aegisthus, and the story about Aegisthus is that there were other great gods that were jealous of his power. So they attacked him and emasculated him. And from that point on, he became Cybele. And she's important because she is the goddess of Mount Ida. Now, a lot of people are kind of confused about where Mount Ida is. There's two of them in mythology. The ones I'm talking about, I'm not talking about the one in Crete that's related to the Minoans. I won't talk about the Minoans at all. I just talk about the Trojans, and I'll talk about Mount Ida. And Mount Ida is the origin of the Trojans. At least that's what their legends say. And Mount Ida was the mountain of Cybele. And she was responsible for the establishment of the city of Troy, but rather it's always said that Athena was responsible for it. Going back to the killing of Pallas, Athena also made a statue that is called the Palladium. It looks like Athena standing on a pedestal holding a spear. So that's where the story of Pallas being her friend or her teacher, someone that looked like her instead of the snake. But the idea of the Jesus being this protecting shield and being made of snakeskin or goat skin is really curious, because you have this same idea, this other idea of Pan being related to the Nachash as well. So you have the snake and you have the goat being both of what the Aegis is supposed to be made up of. So anyway, going back to the Anatolia and Cybele, Anatolia means where the sun rises. I thought that was interesting because Japan's named basically the same thing, the source of the sun, the east, or the sun comes from the east, and so the people from Anatolia were the source of the light, of the knowledge. And they worship that goddess, and I talked about a place called Göbekli Tepe, and that's the fairly recently found archaeological site that's over 10,000 years old. And disproving that there was some very ancient civilization in that area. But they all had a common mother goddess that they worshipped. And you'll find there, and the Greeks imitated what they found, miniature shrines to Cybele. And they're called in Greek Naiskos. I don't know if you've ever seen one, but people will have in their houses, or they used to in like Pompeii, Naiskos, little miniature shrines, and there'd always be a snake somewhere on it, and there'd be Cybele or some other Cybele-like goddess. And I put Cybele at the base as a tree of where the goddesses come from. She is at the base, and it's Athena and Hera and Aphrodite spring kind of from her, and it's more equivalent with Neth and Cybele. I believe Cybele was before Neth, but I'm not a historian or an archaeologist. I'm just a guy who went on the internet and gathered information and started to see a pattern and started to write about. And anyone else can do this, and I'm hoping people will, So, but anyway, the Naiskos, you can still see a lot of people. I think they're in a lot of museums in Greece specifically, and also Rome made a lot of them. But getting away from this goddess, I'll go back to her, especially when I'm talking about the cult of Mithra. At the point when Augustus became Cybele, the blood from the injury caused an almond tree to grow. Almonds very interesting because there's symbolic ideas about almonds in a lot of the architecture in Washington D.C. specifically, but the river goddess, I think it was Nana, picked an almond from the tree that grew, and she put it in her, what's the story? She put the almond in her bosom, and then Attis was born, and Attis is the son of Cybele. And so he comes into the story fairly early, and kind of understanding the story of Attis and Cybele, and I don't mean kinda, I think thoroughly understanding the story is very important, especially if you're going to understand what the Masons are doing with a lot of the symbolism and the worship they go through, and I say worship, or the ritual that they go through. And anyway, Attis was a very peculiar son. He grew up, and his mother Cybele loved him very much, and they became lovers. And he's known for his great beauty and his peculiar dress. He wore, for all intents and purposes, was a stylized deshret. And the people of Anatolia used to be recognized by this peculiar sort of red hats, floppy red hats that they'd wear, which are called the Phrygian cap, the Phrygian caps. And you'll see them a lot on a lot of statues of Athena, and Neth is always wearing one. Attis always wears one, and Cybele sometimes wears them. A lot of other goddesses wear them. I think people don't realize what they are because these ancient statues, art pieces always are not colored anymore. But what this Phrygian cap is this stylized deshret, or this allusion to the bee again. And they're always red, though. And in history, they're always described as red hats, the Phrygian caps. But so he wears that all the time. And the story of Attis goes, it's kind of bizarre. It's you're talking about a god and a goddess. I'm saying Attis is a god. He wasn't necessarily a god. He was sort of a demigod. but Cybele was a goddess, and their Anatolian gods were Proto-Greek, and then the story is that Zeus was having a wedding, and a wedding for Attis, and Attis was preparing to marry the daughter of King Midas. And so Cybele was so jealous because beforehand, of course, they were mother-son, but they were also lovers. And she was so jealous, she came into the wedding ceremony and caused everybody to go ravingly mad. And Attis emasculated himself. And an excellent account of this portion of mythology is in a book by Sir James George Fraser's called The Golden Bough, and I wasn't really familiar with it when before I started my research, but it used to be very popular, I think, in the 1920s. But I definitely recommend that. So Attis castrated himself and died from loss of blood. And Cybele was so remorseful, she asked Zeus to resurrect him, and Zeus refused. And he said, I'm not going to do that, but I'll go halfway, and I'll make him immortal, but he'll be a pine tree now. He'll be in the form of a pine tree, always living, and yet not quite alive. So maybe there's hope for this Attis who died in this act of madness. And it's sort of an ambiguous thing. Why did he go mad? Why did everybody go mad, lose their minds when Cybele came? And I think the answer to that will be more clear towards the end of the book. Thing that was interesting that I think I didn't mention about Attis was when you see any representation of him in art, in ancient art, he has the Phrygian cap, but he also has a very subtle set of bee wings. So that sort of accentuates that idea of him wearing that deshret. People wouldn't call it that, they just call it a Phrygian cap, because he was, of course, from that area in Anatolia, which is modern-day Turkey. And so the interesting thing to talk about is that religion, that belief in Attis and Cybele, carried on from the time way back in Anatolia to the Proto-Greek civilization that lived on the western shores of that peninsula, and later into Greece, and all the way to the 1st century AD in Rome. And it's quite extraordinary what this cult did. The Emperor Claudius, I think, was the one that brought it into the ritual of Roman religion. And one of the most significant ceremonies that they do was, and this will blow a lot of people's minds and kind of put them off of bringing Christmas trees into their house. Unfortunately, I love Christmas, and I really like Christmas trees. I think they're very nice. And anyway, what they would do is the priests of Cybele and Attis would go out into the forest and cut down a pine tree, and then they take it into the town and they place it in the holiest spot in the temple of Cybele. And they dress it up, and they put a little effigy of Attis on it, and they'd wind that with woolen bands, and they'd just decorate it and make it really nice. And then I think it's 2 days after that was the Day of Blood, and they'd have a procession back to the temple, and they'd play really raucous music. The priests were peculiar because they were all eunuchs. If they were followers of Cybele, they were known to be eunuchs, and they'd wear the Phrygian caps, and they dance wildly and there'd be a crescendo of dancing and crazed singing and music playing until they'd get into the temple, and it'd all culminate with a really violent sort of reenaction of what happened to Attis at the wedding, where his jealous mother came in, and he killed himself. They cut themselves and they'd spatter blood all over the tree, adding the blood and the flesh to the tree, though, is what Attis needs to come alive again. It's all about his resurrection, and the question is, well, why do we want this Attis to come back as a human? And the reason for this is because of who he really symbolizes. The Nachash was brought down low by the curse of God when he first met Eve in the garden. And by meeting the woman, or the symbol of humanity to him, he now will have this opportunity, by using her humanness, so to speak, her genetics, or his interaction with her, to eventually become human himself, imitating what God had already done, or at our time has already done. It's a type of death that the Nachash endured. When they talk about the sleeping god Attis, that's what they're talking about. The people that look at the garden event in the 180 degrees, the illuminated fraternities that look at the garden event, the opposite of how we look at it, of course, say, well, if Satan, if this angel that came there wasn't cursed and somehow restricted from what he really wanted to do, really wanted to help mankind, we would be fine now.
Mm-hmm.
But this jealous God wrecked everything and cursed the snake and us, and now we need to wait and work through whatever the plan is until our God comes back. And that's sort of what the Attis cult is saying. Well, sort of. It really is what it is saying, but not a lot of people will get that, I think. Anyway, I did say the fall when Attis dies. No, of course it's the spring. The interesting thing is the Romans later on, 100 years later or so, stopped following the cult, the specific Phrygian cult of Attis and Cybele, but they kept the god Attis, or the demigod Attis. They changed him into a powerful, more full-fledged god, and called him Sol Invictus, which means invincible sun. And the peculiar thing was, though, even though this was Attis under a different name, this god's birthday was December 25th. Attis is dying in the springtime. When the Earth's coming alive, it's sort of the idea of the garden being present, or becoming present, the beginning of mankind. And you have the Nachash, his incursion into the garden, and his death because of the curse. He waits 9 months, and then you have Sol Invictus, right? You have this idea of the sun god being born at the time. But the initiates know really who we're talking about. We're talking about Attis becoming Sol Invictus and being born again. And
Wow.
It's interesting that it actually was acted out over a century by the Roman religion, starting with Claudius, and then later on they started worshiping Sol Invictus. And Sol Invictus, he's endured for thousands of years under the same name. And the cult of Mithras, which I will talk much more about later, he's very important. But right now, still talking about Sol Invictus, I wanted to mention one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the Colossus. The statue of the Titan Helios, the sun god, was by another name, Apollo or Attis, and he stood over 98 feet high, and he was put there by the city, the people of the city, because in honor of him, because they thought that he was the one that protected them from the invasion by Antigonus the First, the One-Eyed. And I might have mentioned this already, but it was in the southern Doric region, and which means those were the Proto-Greeks that lived in that part of Turkey or Anatolia, and just above them was the Ionic region. And people who study classical architecture realize that those are classes of that type of architecture, and with the Doric being the most simple form, and Ionic being more complex. Definitely they have their design parameters that they have to be in. They're very, very specific. The other one was Corinthian, but in just to the north of the Colossus was the Temple of Artemis, and that's interesting because, and I haven't talked about Artemis, but she was also known as the mother of Mount Ida, like Cybele was. And
okay.
these two goddesses are very similar in many respects, and the Trojans both worship Cybele and Artemis, and they may not have really had it very much. They distinguish between the two, because over time, goddesses in different cultures are adopted and take on different aspects of the older ones, but she's really the same thing. And this sort of leads me to a point that I wanted to make, which is very strange, and it concerns another wonder of the ancient world, the Mausoleum of Halicarnassus, or Halicarnassus.
Oh, okay.
And it was said that it was made by the wife of a guy named Mausolus, and Mausolus is interesting because his name means the one, or the one son. If you look at the etymology of Mausolus and Mao, and in ancient Greek, of course, the word came from much older culture, and it's not really known what its origins were, because it was in Anatolia. It could have been attributed to a lot of different cultures, but anyway, Mausolus, he died, and his wife built a huge temple to inter him, and when she died, she was put there too. She was buried in the same temple, and it just started after that to be called, any nice building where the dead were buried was now a mausoleum.
Oh, okay.
The one sun, so it has an allusion to the idea of the sun god. This building does, and interesting feature of the Mausoleum of Halicarnassus was, at the very top there was this golden chariot that was pulled by 4 horses, and you had Artemisa and Mausolus in the chariot. But what that was showing was, of course, Attis and Cybele riding in triumph together again. It's an idea of the resurrection of Attis, now back with her mother riding triumphantly. And I don't remember exactly when that temple was destroyed, but my point is, and I am getting to it here slowly, that there's an imitation of this building in Washington, D.C., and it happens to be the headquarters of the Scottish Rite Freemasons.
Oh,
And
wow.
they call it the Supreme Council of the Scottish Rite, and it's located in Washington, D.C., as I said, 16th Street Northwest, And the reason that's kind of curious is I remember seeing a picture of Tom Horn standing in that building. He went there, I think he was invited and shown around by someone. And the room he was staying in was called the Pillars of Charity. And it's a very peculiar room because they have a bust of Albert Pike there.
Oh, wow.
So the pillars, and then a sort of a recess, and then a really nice bright, it's not a mosaic, but it's like stained glass, and I can't remember what the design was. I think it's probably an all-seeing eye. I'll have to look at it again. But anyway, not only is Albert Pike's bust there, but he's buried there. It is a true mausoleum. And in fact, I think there was a special act of Congress in 1944 where they said it was okay to actually bury someone other than in the graveyard. So the Scottish Rite Freemasons have their patron, I think, buried there. And Albert Pike is known as one of the greatest Masons of all time.
Wow.
Incredibly intelligent guy. The volume and the quality of his writings are really just incredible. He wrote Morals and Dogma.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you're familiar with it, but that is sort of the Bible of Freemasonry. It talks about each level from 1 to 32. And for at least Scottish Rite, you can't work your way up to the 33rd degree. You have to have that given to you by the high-ranking members. But the point being about that is that kind of shows how important the whole idea, the whole understanding, and more than that, the understanding of just what this cult of Attis and Cybele was all about. There's I think people have said there is research out there, and the Freemasons deny it, that they are in any way related to the cult of Mithra, and I say, and I write in the book, that the cult of Cybele and Attis are directly related to the cult of Mithra. I say Mithras. Later, the Greeks call him Mithras, but his name is originally from the Persian Mithra. But he is, if you think of Cybele and Attis, he is an amalgamation of the two. He is Attis in the stage of his rebirth. But I'll go into that a little bit more later on. So the next thing that I wanted to talk about, I think, is going to be probably, if anything, is controversial. I'm not saying anything that's really too outlandish in the book, but I think this is different, and I hadn't heard it, I haven't seen it anywhere, and it has something to do with identifying what the importance of the bull or the ox is in mythology. When I first started working with it and thinking that it was really more valid, I didn't really want to believe it, or it's not really, it's not saying it very well. It's I really thought that I would find out later that I was probably going in a wrong direction, or it really didn't make, or wouldn't make sense later on. But as it's turned out, the longer I go, the more it makes sense to me, the more evidence I find to support it. And anyhow, starting out with the concept is you'll see Zeus a lot, the father of all the ancient gods in Greek and Roman myth, turning himself into a bull very often. He appeared as the Cretan bull and abducted Europa. Later on, he, as a Cretan bull again, he sired the Minotaur, or you call Minos, King Minos's bull. And so that's good. This powerful god, like a bull, the most powerful god would take on some type of aspect of some powerful animal. I guess he could have been a tiger, but he always chooses to be a bull for some reason. Not always. He's been other things, but it's common. His his brother Poseidon, Zeus's brother Poseidon, also manifests as a bull from time to time. But you think, well, the ancient world depended on cattle, and for a lot of different things. So that's another reason why I guess you could say, well, mythology, the bull is very special, and a bull sacrifice is done a lot because it is a valuable animal to the ancients, and that's a valid point too. But you also see a weird theme, sort of it's a triune theme of, this is strange. It's not necessarily bull horns, but it's sometimes interpreted as a crescent moon and a star and a woman together, all like in Egypt, Hathor is displayed, and she's represented by a woman with a half moon or above her head and a star, usually. And if you look at Zeus abducting Europa, you read into the story later on, you'll see that another consort of Europa was Asterion, which means the starry one. And if you look at a lot of stories where there's bulls, you'll see that a woman character, a woman figure, and the bull interacting, and then there's also a star or a serpent. And so the bull is important in that. I think I've identified what the star is, or perhaps not. The serpent is definitely identified, and the woman's identified, going back to the garden. The star, a lot of the time, is a replacement idea for the Nachash, because he's, of course, the serpent is what he used to be, and he's going to rise and be the bright light, because he symbolizes knowledge. So the brightest star in the sky would be a symbol for him. In our case, in the northern hemisphere, it would be Sirius, but I won't digress to that right now. So as the ancients, or the illuminated, understand, when you see a bull, or you see Zeus as a bull, or you see a bull anywhere in myth, it doesn't necessarily always mean that it's Zeus, even though that might be the name. Or rather, I think it's better to say that when the ancients are talking about Zeus, they are referring to the one god. And this is controversial. Well, Zeus is the god of the gods of ancient myth. How can you say they're really referring to the one god that created man in the garden?
Right.
And well, you have to look at it in the light of the illuminated today. When they're talking about mythology, that's who they are talking about when they're referring to Zeus. If you look at it that way, it's a little bit easier to accept. You have to identify the characters in the story before you can understand the story.
Right.
And methods of doing that are looking into the words themselves. Where did the word come from, whatever language it is? What does the word really mean? Isn't there a Bible written that's called the exposed word version, where each word in Hebrew is translated out instead of left? Speaking of an ox, in Hebrew, the word for ox is shor, spelled shin vav resh, and it means an ox. But a lot of the time you can look at the word in Hebrew and then look at its root to see, get a little bit more meaning from it. And I don't know if guilty is quite the term, but I'm guilty of doing that a lot, because I'm not going to just stop. Oh, well, it means, oh, what's the root? The root a lot of the time tells you much more. A lot of people, sort of disregard that and say, well, you're stretching, and I don't believe that really at all, especially if you're looking at the word like anyway, very, very old words describing what's going on in the garden. You definitely look to see what the roots are. Anyway, the root word for sure is sure, spelled the same way, same letters in Hebrew, but different, I guess you could say, inflection marks, but the term for it is nikud, and I believe I'm saying or pronouncing that correctly, but those are, I would say, very subtle changes to the way something is written in Hebrew, but you pronounce it differently, and of course the meaning's different. So the root word means to go around or journey. So you have the word for ox, meaning of course ox, but its root meaning to journey or go in a circle. And well, I thought about that for a while. Of course, Taurus, the constellation Taurus, circles every night, goes overhead, and that makes sense to think. Well, I guess there's a big ox in the sky that goes around all the time. Also, in the ancient world and even modern world, they used oxen to thresh grain, and they would be going in a circuit too. And that idea is used a lot. The idea of men being like wheat, having a short time being alive and being fruitful, and then having, being ready for the harvest. A lot of allegory and the idea of wheat and men being threshed, thrown up in the air, and having the chaff blow away, and the good fruit coming down, and what is not needed blows over a fire and explodes, explosively ignites. And then I thought a little bit more about this idea. What is it? What is it about the word? When I say the word, I'm talking about the written word of God, the Old Testament and our New Testament, and I went to its origin, and I think a lot about pi and the idea of a circuit. This whole thing started this curse of the Nachash, where he started his I guess you could say limited kingdom on earth was Genesis 3:14, and you'd think, well, now paradise is lost, God left the presence of Eden, and we have this corrupted world with this thing, this Nachash, that went in and started his own way of doing things by getting Eve to become this new creature, with her eyes open. Now she knows evil as well as good, and he's going to be the repository of the knowledge and give it out in whatever way he decides, but there's going to be a certain amount of time that's going to pass, and then he's going to resurrect, bringing his idea of paradise back to earth, removing pillars. So there's this full cycle that has to occur. But of course, at the time of the curse, God also made a prophecy that man would crush his head, even though the serpent would be a problem for him, striking at his heel. And indeed, Christ has died and has risen. There's already a stage that's completely finished. Now we have God back, or we have a path back to Him. So in a stage, as far as us as believers, the pillars have been taken away. There's another stage, of course, that's going to be coming. Christ is going to be returning, and that literally will be when heaven comes back to earth, the final remaining idea of the pillars being removed. But Satan's going to try to counterfeit this, of course, and as much in a fashion as much as possible, similar to what people expect Christ to do. That Christ is going to return. Well, Satan's going to try to imitate that in any way
Right.
he can,
Yeah.
so he can fool as many people as possible. But so though I went off on this tangent on the circle idea, the circuit idea. I want to come back to why I thought about that, because the law, the word, is written, and it uses the language, and that language has naturally an alphabet. And where was it first written in a written form and given to man? And that was on Mount Sinai, when God himself, with his own finger, wrote on the tablets the Ten Commandments, gave them to Moses. So what is that alphabet of that language that's holy enough that God would use it? That idea of a very early language was talked about by my brother in his book Temple at the Center of Time. He wrote that Eupolemus in 158 BC wrote that Moses was the first wise man to teach an alphabet to the Jews, who then transferred them the alphabet to the Phoenicians, and then of course Phoenicians transferred it to the Greeks, and that is probably contrary to a lot of what people would, people think that the Phoenician was earlier than Hebrew, but the Phoenician has 22 letters, and it has not a peculiar, but a very straightforward ending letter, the Tav, which means mark, and it's just a cross. I guess you'd say St. Andrew's cross. No, it's
Right.
instead of this, it's this.
Oh, okay.
And looking at it, I think, well, that is a very significant letter. What if this idea came to me? Okay, well, what if you represented an alphabet in a circle, in a circular form, or in the form of a circuit? You'd have to have a beginning and an end, but it's ambiguous. I mean, but in the case of a writing system or alphabet that's holy to the one God, what is the most significant letter? The cross.
Right.
So put the cross at the top, and Phoenician would then be 21 characters. You take out the aleph for the first letter, which happens, the very first letter, I realized, and I don't know at this time if we're going to have an image out, but hopefully I can explain it fairly well and bring the image out with words. As a non-word facile as I am today with this headache. Anyway, the aleph represents the head of a bull. That's what it means, bull head, and it looks like a bull head literally turned on its side. But if you look at it carefully, it could be the combination of two tavs connected, sort of in this fashion, if this two x's like this
Right.
together. There's just a slight overlap of one portion of the letter. In that case, you could have either the tav, or the cross, or the bull's head as a representation that now the alphabet's connected at the top, where the tav is at the head, and to designate that it is connected there, we're going to actually write both the tavs together and combine them, and that makes something that looks like a bull's head. And later on, you take that combination apart and you leave the aleph alone. It's now a new letter, and you take the tav apart and you make it an alphabet as we understand them, written from one end to the other. Now it's not eternal in that sense that there's no beginning or an end to it. And of course, man takes it and corrupts it. Maybe it was a bit complicated to always write an alphabet in a circular fashion. But that idea is where the image of the bull's head comes. So the idea that God himself is going to come down to this earth and become a man, that legend before that actually occurred was in the mind of all the creatures that inhabited his creation. It was a big deal. And God himself definitely would have a language that was holy, a perfect writing system. And he used it, and he gave his law to men, gave it to Moses, gave it to the Israelites. And the letter at the head, now there's an extra letter after the combination of at the head of the Aleph of the two Tavs, has 22 letters. Of course, so Phoenician has 22 letters, not 21, and modern Hebrew has 22, I'd say, base letters. There's extensions of the same letter. That Aleph and Tav idea being connected, I think, is what led to the idea of the bull representing the one God, because his language, his circular representation of a language, of the alphabet that he used to give his law, give his writings, and there's something magical about writing, is because it endures, where you can have truth in it, and it can be eternal. As far as man's concerned, it can exist as long as men honestly reproduce it or keep it intact. That image of a circular writing system is also a symbol for God. And the Aleph at the top, where the Tavs are connected, where the Tav is just one, I'm not saying there's two of them, there was originally just one.
Right.
That idea is a representation of God. So that combination of the Tavs becoming the Aleph, which looks like a head of a bull, now the bull in turn is becoming a symbol for God. It's interesting too if you look at what the Masons do with their square and compass. I know they say, well, the tools of being a Mason, you need to be able to make circles perfectly. So you use the compass and the square. Everything needs to be very precise to be making buildings that have integrity, like the Freemasons have integrity, like they say they have integrity. But you'll often see the compass and the square with two hands holding each other in between. And if it's drawn this way, it really accentuates the idea of the Tavs being joined. And I think the upper echelons of Freemasonic or illuminated fraternities understand this concept of the bullhead, the Aleph, and the writing system. And in fact, one of the Egyptian gods, the very important Egyptian gods, was Thoth, and his animal symbol or his animal manifestation was Attis, which you'd see on the shores of the Nile eating, but they looked as if they're writing in the mud. From Thoth, you have Mercury, the Roman Mercury, and before him you have Hermes. These are all the same god: Thoth, Hermes, and Mercury.
In your research with everything that you've come across with this idea of the bull, have you found any connections with that like the first chapter of Ezekiel or in Revelation, where it talks about the cherubim and how one of them actually has the head of an ox? Has that come up? Is there any correlation between those two, do you think?
I've considered that. My brother talked about the constellations and that sort of mirror in the way that the cherubim appear. The brightest stars in each, the bright constellation has a brightest star. I think, let's see, it'd be Taurus. I'm trying to think of the stars in Taurus right now, but I'm drawing a blank, lamely. Oh, Aldebaran. And that idea of the heavens being surrounded the earth and the angels mirroring somehow God's creation in their appearance. But I have looked at the Old Testament, a very old book in the Old Testament, the book of Job, and found something that I thought was not, I don't know if the word peculiar is a good word to describe it, but that stood out to me in relating this idea of this ox, this idea of the ox at the head of the circuit, this idea of being the symbol for God. I think it's in Job 40 where God's describing his power and using the beast known as Behemoth, and talking about how it eats grass. And that word, if you look at it, Behemoth, from the word Behemah, actually means a wild beast, but it also can mean cattle. And interestingly, I mean, you have this idea, this image of an incredibly powerful beast of the field, ox-like, and then immediately the next thing that God's talking about is Leviathan. And Leviathan also has another meaning, which alludes to that idea of this circuit again, with the ox at the top. A leva, or Leviathan, is the sea monster, but it comes from the word leva, which means to be joined. And my brother Dave talked about Leviathan, and very extensively in Sidonia, the Secret Chronicles of Mars. And the Ouroboros, the snake, with its tail in its mouth.
Right. Yeah.
And its relation to the cycle of the aeons. And I definitely won't go off on that direction because it's already been well explained. At the head of the circuit is the cross. And if you think of what Christ did, completing the circuit of what happened, or the tragedy that happened in the Garden of Eden, man fell, God left. The path for man to God was very difficult, right? God reached down and gave the Israelites his law, took them out of Egypt, out of slavery, and led them into the land he promised to them. And from them being there in the land, there was a place where they could build finally the temple, and then the Messiah could come and then do what was prophesied in Genesis. And Christ came and did that. And at the resurrection, now you have a completion of the circuit. It's sort of a circuit within a circuit. The first set, you have now man's with God, and Nachash comes to the garden and convinces Eve to do what God told her not to. God leaves paradise. You have the separation of heaven and earth. And you have, more importantly, an impediment now set in place where man has no communion with God anymore. He needs to go through now the temple priests. As you came back into the temple that was built in Jerusalem, it was surrounded by ceremony, sacrifice of animals, and you had the high priest only one time a year actually going into the holiest place to talk to God or have God talk to him. And after Christ's resurrection, the separating portion of the temple, the holy place, where you looked in, was now torn in half. Now we can directly have a relationship with God through his Son. So that is a completion of the circuit. So if you go to Golgotha, the place of the skull, or the place of the at the head, you physically have an image of God at the cross, at the very
Wow.
top. He's at the cross. So you have more. You have the idea of God's holiness, but that same image, that same circular idea, or that connecting at the top where the cross is now where Christ finished or completed the circuit. And that is the main reason why I think that concept of the letter circuit is quite valid. More I look at what the illuminated fraternities are playing at, especially with modern media, sort of the hidden in plain sight games that they play, which they love, I'm seeing that they most likely understand this concept as well. Even in the architecture, in classical architecture, there's a thing called bucranium. Just means bull skull, and you'll see in the temples you'll have a bull skull and then a rose. That idea of the head, a roche, or a play on words that they love to do, and then another bull skull, and then a roche again, and that has its own term for the way it's decorated on these temples. And also in mythology and a lot of Gnosticism, you'll see rituals that are done that add to the validity of this idea of this circuit, this bull circuit idea. And I'll probably call it from now either ox circuit or bull circuit interchangeably. But there's this thing that the ancients did with bees, or the belief they had about the generation of bees. And it was called Bugonia. And unfortunately, I realized that the word Bugonia was spelled incorrectly in the book. It's the flower, begonia, B-E-G-O-N-I-A. It should be B-U-G-O-N-I-A, begonia. And that is the belief in the spontaneous generation of bees. But not just the spontaneous generation of bees, but specifically generating bees by killing oxen. I hadn't heard about this until maybe 2 years ago, and when I stumbled upon it, I thought it's probably one of the strangest things I've ever researched. Beekeeping was an important part of ancient civilization, and the gods had the attribute of being expert beekeepers. I think Apollo's son was his name. Aristeus was an expert beekeeper. And the Neoplatonists believe that souls, or the many, descended into incarnation on earth. And after death, they ascended back into heaven, where they became one with an intelligence. But the Begonia idea, well, I'll just explain like one method of Begonia. What they would do is they would bury an ox up to its horns and let it die. And they leave it there a specific amount of time. So like 3 weeks, let it rot in the soil. And then they come up with an axe. And another peculiarity is they'd use a double-bladed axe.
Oh, wow.
And they'd strike the bull with a part where his horns are emerging in the head. And it was said that the bees would emerge. That's strange. But a stranger account, and this is a bit, I don't know, it leads into the idea of this sort of angelic control or angelic desire or to control the lives of men or the destiny of men. And of course, the Nachash is angelic. But there is a Roman philosopher, Pliny the Elder, and he had a set of instructions about how to generate bees. And what they do is they'd build a specifically sized building for this. A cube, it would be equal height and width, and they'd go inside with an ox and they'd beat the animal to death with clubs, breaking as many bones as they could, being careful not to break the skin. And then they'd cover all the holes of this the bull up with pitch. They'd make sure there's no open areas. They'd damage the skin, and coat it with clay, and then they'd seal the whole house in the same manner with clay and pitch, and they'd leave it there for 3 weeks, and they'd come back, and they wouldn't enter it right away, but they'd open the downwind side of the place and let light in. And later on, I think they'd wait another 11 days, they'd go into the building, and they would expect to find it just infested with bees. Just they'd be full of bees. I think it's written that they'd be hanging together in clusters.
Oh, wow.
And the ox would be completely consumed. There'd be nothing left but hair and bones, and of course its horns. The interesting thing I thought about that is the 3 weeks, or 21 days plus 11 is 32, and that has all the hallmarks of the signature of this 32 or 33 idea, the idea of a third. The Masons are absolutely fixated on it, and the simplest explanation I can give is the same that my brother used to give, and that is just the third of the angels. It's,
right.
That identity, the third that went with the Nachash. But that is extremely peculiar. But the reason I bring all this up about Bugonia is, I mean, the question is, why would they do something like that? Why first of all, would it take beating a bull to death very violently and to create bees, you know? And if you consider that the ancients considered the bull as a symbol for God himself, and they were allied with the Nachash, well, then the bull is hated. The bull needs to be violently or killed with prejudice. And only after it's killed this way will then the souls that this jealous god keeps in prison be released.
Right.
I don't think anybody explains Bugonia in that fashion, and it's sort of a curiosity. They say that the Neoplatonists used to practice, and I have not been able to find a lot of literature about it, but this is the idea behind it, that the god's their enemy, and you'll find in mythology a lot of the time that bulls are sacrificed. I mean, that's not so strange, but this idea of beating a bull to death and having bees generate spontaneously from its carcass is definitely interesting in the light of what the reversed understanding of the garden is, and
right.
the idea that through the idea of the ox circuit, that symbolic way an alphabet is represented that's holy to God himself, that gives you the idea of the hatred for the bull. Well, that's the one God. That's the one God that imprisoned mankind in the garden and would have left them there unless the Nachash had come to free us. So
it makes a lot of sense too with what you were talking about, how they would split the bull's head at the horns, because that's almost like breaking that circuit right at the hole.
yeah, absolutely. And I hadn't considered that, but that makes a lot of sense. So I guess it's a good segue into the cult of Mithra. This is a extremely big deal when it comes to the Masons, and I think I might have mentioned this before. The Masons will never ever say that they have anything to do with the cult of Mithra. They'll say their ceremonies have nothing to do with that, and I can prove that is complete obfuscation. There is a symbol of the cult, and it was a naked lion-headed man. I think the term for it is lientocephaline, and this is a very peculiar looking sort of statue. It's supposed to be a representation of Mithras, and I say Mithras. It sounds better to me instead of Mithra, but it's the Greek way of saying the god's name. But this lion man usually is shown standing on the earth with a tav, and he's wrapped by a snake all the way up past his waist, and he has a peculiar sort of winged back. He has 4 wings, just like a cherubim has, or is said to have in Ezekiel's vision. This thing is, I didn't talk about the idea of what the lion really represents, but it really is as angelic as any images that the ancients had for their gods. Especially the 4 wings is very, very interesting.
Yeah.
Sort of digress here. There's that city in Iraq called Nineveh.
Uh-huh.
Same city that Jonah went to preach, said that they need to repent. And of course, I was talking to you about Jonah a little bit earlier, and I wrote a little bit about Jonah in the book. But there was an artifact found in Nineveh, I think back, the early 1900s, and it was an angelic figure it had 4 wings, and I think it was in a sitting position, and it was in that weird sort of characteristic Baphomet position of having one arm up and one arm down.
Right.
And its face too looked sort of vaguely lion-like. And the archaeologists said that this was the Babylonian god named Pazuzu, the god of wind. But it looks a lot like the modern representation of the Baphomet, or the description of it. And I'll get back to it, but it also reminds me of this because it has the 4 wings. It looks like the representation of this statue that the cult Mithras used.
Oh, wow.
And, it came from Nineveh, and it also was used as this background image in The Exorcist, if you remember, if you've ever seen that movie. When Max von Sydow went there, or was it von Sydow that was the archaeologist / priest guy? But anyway, that statue of Pazuzu that they actually excavated from Nineveh was in the movie. That idea of throwing images out all the time in plain sight, the Illuminated love that because it's hermetic, and I think that's one of the last things I'll talk about in this series is hermeticism.
Okay.
And I have a lot to say about that. I think it's a good thing to kind of wrap up. But talking about Mithras at this point is very good because it's so steeped in what the Masons are doing right now. And in fact, the illuminated elite that control the banking systems in this country and the government of this country are absolutely hermetic in how they operate. Hermes, is the way. He shows the way of how to act. And I will stop talking about Hermes right now, but I will definitely get into him later. But you can only understand Hermes really well if you first understand the cult of Mithras and who Mithras was. And so from going on to talking about the lion-headed symbol for the cult or Mithras himself, should talk about the history of the cult. It's one of the oldest religions, it is said to be, and it came out of Anatolia to via probably Babylon, Persia, and Mithra was worshipped openly all the way till later in Roman history, actually until Christianity overshadowed the practice of the cult, and the Roman soldiers were definitely into the cult. And even to this day, you can find the caves or the Mithraeum that they used to have their services or their rituals in. And a lot of them, I mean, you'll find them up from Great Britain all the way to Egypt, all over the Mediterranean, Greece, Rome. Of course, Anatolia, you'll find the Mithraeum, and they're either natural or man-made caves, very characteristic sort of arched entranceways, and they have a specific requirement that they be built by flowing water.
Oh, okay.
And that's important to remember. But a lot of the time, if they're newer, you'll find an altar in the center of the cave, this area, and sometimes you'll find a statue of Mithras there. And what he'll be doing is he'll be in the act of slaughtering a bull. And he does it in a specific position. And the art of the cult is very peculiar. One that you'll see a lot is called a tauroctony, which means bull murder. And in the image, you'll see Mithras, astride a bull with a sword going through its chest, in front of its chest, and he'll be holding the bull with his, I believe it's his left hand by the nose, and he'll be looking over his right shoulder towards Sol Invictus, or it's said to be Sol Invictus. And if you're looking at this thing called the tauroctony, you'll see, and it's not talked about a lot in the description, only Sol Invictus is, and there'll always be a line or something drawn between Mithras looking at Sol Invictus, a comet going toward it or something. But to Mithras' left, there'll be this woman somehow emerging from rock with this crescent moon above her head. Emerging from the rock. It reminds me of a specific deity from Anatolia. And below him, there'll be a serpent and a scorpion and a dog. And a lot of people talk about the relationship that has with the constellations, but I don't go into that at all. I talk about the meaning behind what you're seeing there in that depiction of Mithras killing the bull. And if you buy the idea that the bull is symbolizing the one God, it is really a diabolical sort of chilling image, because what you have there is you have Cybele, or Eve, on one side emerging from the rock as symbol, as a symbol of Cybele. She's always said to be emerging continually from rock. She's not fully expressed herself yet. And then you have Sol Invictus. It's also emerging from the rock. He is somehow restrained as well, but Mithras looks almost exactly like Sol Invictus.
Oh, wow.
Has the halo of light around his head. He wears a Phrygian cap. He is on top of this bull, killing it, murdering a bull. And that is an expression of the triumph of Attis finally being resurrected and conquering God. It also is interesting to realize that Mithra's birthday is the same as Sol Invictus. It's the 25th of December. The Mithraeum that I was talking about with the running water are important. And in Washington, D.C., there happens to be a Mithraeum that they built, and there's what you'd expect there, running water, and it looks very much like what you'd find in Rome, and it's at a lower level. I don't recall the name of the person that made it. Originally, I think there was going to be two of them, but just being the kind of person I am, I went on Google Earth and I measured the distance between the western entrance of the Capitol building and this area, and it's 666 feet away. I call it the Grotto, and it's for tourists or people just to rest after they're wandering around the Capitol area. And the word grotto comes from the Italian grotta, which just means crypt. That idea, so you have Mithras wearing the Phrygian cap, that Deshret red cap, that bee proboscis cap that Neth wore from the bright lands. Eventually, they're wanting to reconnect to the dark lands or the earth lands controlled by Set. You have the allegory of Mithras, the bee god, the sun god, finally coming to earth, finally through his unification with his mother, being manifest as Mithras, and as Mithras, a final triumph over the god that cursed him. That's sort of, it took a long time to get to this point where I'm actually talking about what that Tauroctony scene represents, and I've looked a lot at the information out there about, maybe someone has a better idea about the cult of Mithras, but it's ritual, the meaning of the rituals, mostly everybody who does any study on this says that they've been lost. At the time that it was a very popular cult, the meaning of the rituals were closely guarded. It was just like the Masons do today. They're, if you go into the Brotherhood, some of the first things you'll hear are the warnings and the punishments that will be given to anyone who joins and then divulges any of the secrets. The guy that built the grotto's name was Olmsted, and I think it was built in like 1874. But that's all I have to say about the area of Washington, D.C. for now. I'll probably talk about it a lot more. But connecting specifically the Freemasons to the cult of Mithras. Have you ever seen and this is all over the internet, images scanned from the Freemasons monitor from the late 1800s and early 1900s. There's a depiction, and I have it in the book, of the all-seeing eye. As you're looking at to the left is the sun, and then there's a comet going towards the sun, and then there's some stars next to the comet, and then to the right there's this crescent moon. And it happens to coincide, if you lay it over the top of the Tauroctony, you have the moon right over where Cybele is emerging from the rock, and you have the sun right where Sol Invictus happens to be, and the comet, that line going towards the sun, is exactly where Mithras is looking at Sol Invictus.
Oh, wow.
With the starry background, that asterion idea, the starry one, you'll see that a lot, that starry idea that the Nachash is related to knowledge. These stars, the one that has it is the one with stars, or the starry one. Underneath that image, you'll you'll see the typically sort of obfuscated Masonic explanation of what they're showing you. It never, of course, is very near the truth, or if there is a little bit of truth in it, you can see the person who's writing it is feeling very clever. Oh, I'm concealing this well, you know.
Right.
And, it says, the all-seeing eye, whom the sun and moon and stars obey, and under whose watchful care even the comets perform their stupendous revolutions, pervades the inmost recesses of the human heart, and will reward us according to our merits. That's interesting, because there's nothing about the cult of Mithras there, or the identity of the entity that they're worshiping, or they're worshiping and hoping to get knowledge from, that would end in eventual eternal life for them. And that's another thing that I don't think any Freemason would tell you. I mean, what's the ultimate goal of you being a Freemason? And I don't know what they'd tell me, but I don't think it would be eternal life.
Right.
But the Christian would say that to you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right away. Ultimately, I mean, a relationship with God, and of course, that, I mean, eternal life naturally follows from that. The Freemason would say, a high-level one would say, well, through the knowledge that I'm going to get, that I am getting because I understand, and because Hermes will bless me, or the Nachash, aka Hermes, will bless me, I will get eternal life. Eventually, maybe not just yet, but thinking about the cult of Mithras, I thought, wow, you know, the bullfight has more meaning than I originally expected. You have a brightly dressed, skillful, athletic person in the ring. He's antagonizing the bull. You know, he's humiliating the bull. He's turning his back to it. He's, you know, getting in its way and avoiding it, disregarding its, you know, its danger to him. And then he takes his barbed wands and he, you know, sticks it in the back, you know, tortures the bull for a while. And if he's a successful matador, and he kills the bull with a sword like Mithras did with one stroke, only when he decides to do it. And interesting, Spanish matador is he's a dancer, and he wears a suit of lights. So that idea again too, that Mithras is the sun or the bright one. I don't think, you know, people, especially the United States, know about the name of the suit he wears, but that's sort of an allusion to the idea that he's related to that bull killing cult figure, Mithras. If you assign core identities to figures in myth, then the meanings of the stories come out. So, of course, you'll see a lot of these three things together when you're talking about mythological stories. The Nachash, of course, is a snake. There's a lot of snake-like creatures in myth. Or also the sun, or the star, a singular star. In the case illustrating this, Europa was abducted by Cretan bull, or Zeus, the beautiful white bull, and taken away. And later, Europa married Asterion, and I thought that was an interesting story. I sort of set that aside now. Continue though. The bull, of course, up to this point we've established, or I've established in the book too, that it's a symbol for the one God, and that's fairly radical. I don't think a lot of people would say that necessarily, and I'm saying no, it really symbolizes the one God, if you're trying to understand really the core of what mythology is saying. So, and then the woman, of course, the woman goddesses in myth are aspects of the parthenogenic Eve. And parthenogenic portion we've gone over. The golden mean is very important, and that self-generated idea that comes from what Eve did, and the Nachash with his Libri striking at the head of God, or Prometheus rather, striking at the head of Zeus, caused this parthenogenic creature to emerge in full armor with bright eyes. So Athena also has a strange name, or a name that's not used too often, and it's something probably a lot of people haven't heard of, and it's tritogenia. And it still goes towards this idea. And in fact, the Egyptian goddess Hathor is a good example of what the meaning of tritogenia is. Because I was talking about this triune core meaning assignment in mythology. Again, the bull is God, the woman goddess aspect is Eve. So if you're looking at Hathor, for example, she's depicted often, almost all the time, with bull horns in the form of a full bull, or a woman with a bull's head, and always between the horns is a sun or a star. You'll probably have an overlay of a picture of Hathor here holding a ox goad, and she has a woman's head, and interestingly, the snakes encircling the sun inside the bull horns. She's also holding an ankh. Let me step back a second here again. The bull horns are often switched too in mythology and these ancient religions, goddess religions specifically, with the crescent moon. Just for the simple fact that, of course, bull horns look like the crescent moon and vice versa.
Right.
And
Yeah.
the woman often is associated with the moon, and that's extremely important in alchemy and the symbols in alchemy. And I'll be maybe getting to that portion. It's at the end of the book that describes the meaning of what this creature or this entity or this even idea of Hermes is. What is Hermes? What is Hermeticism? And I think one of the most interesting points, or as I came to the understanding, what is this idea of the twins in mythology? Why are the twins so important? And anyway, I'll continue on, get back to the ankh. And you'll see Hathor here, she's holding an ankh. And the symbol in ancient Egypt meant eternal life. And I see it always in one orientation, with the cross at the bottom. Oh, and I didn't describe what the ankh is. It looks like a cross with a loop at the top. But when a lot of these depictions of gods or goddesses are holding the ankh, it's not necessarily in that orientation with the cross down. They'll hold it like with their arms crossed or out straight or up, the cross up. Just turn the ankh over so the cross is at the top, at the head, at the Rosh. Now you have the circuit below. What better symbol is it of eternal life, or the power of eternal life, than the symbol for the one God? The writing system that is the symbol for God, that's holy to God. No one out on the internet says that. I've never seen any information about it. Of course, no one's ever talked about the Ankh circuit. Speaking of the bullfight, Ishtar, she holds 2 ankhs, and I don't know if people are familiar with the Queen of Heaven picture of Ishtar. She has a 3-layered crown of horns of some animal. They're most likely bull horns. Why not? She has strange-looking wings. She looks like some type of angel. She has bird feet. She has 2 lions next to her, very Cybele-like. And then, of course, owls. It's aspects of Athena, aspects of Cybele, and she's holding these eternal life symbols. Very, very interesting. Getting on to myth, though, and having core identity understood, there's also another aspect. There's an underlying theme that the Nachash has that can be fleshed out if you step back a second and look, or step back for a time and look at what myth is saying, and that is that the Nachash has plans for this world that he's been implementing ever since the garden, but they're going to come to a head, I think, fairly soon. But a really good illustration of this concept is the story of Apollo going to Delphi. And Delphi, at the time before Apollo went there, was ruled by Python. And Python guarded the Omphalos, which was the substitute stone given to Kronos, the father of Zeus.
Right.
So that Kronos wouldn't swallow Zeus, and that's in Hesiod's Theogony, Origin of the Gods. And I won't digress to that story. I don't think we did cover that, but it's in the book. Apollo went when he was young, and he eventually killed Python. And the word Python is interesting because it means to rot, and Delphi or Delphi is interesting as well because it means womb. And the word dolphin, I mean, it's a fish-like creature, it's a mammal, but it's a womb fish, right? And the snake, Python, lived in the ground, or chthonic Python, ground dwelling, like the religion of Mithras. That was a chthonic religion, inside of caves, underground. Strange, there's this underground sort of theme with a lot of these, but Apollo, the shining one, he went to Delphi, defeated the serpent there, and it became Apollo's oracle now. Well, why? Why would he do such a thing? And I might have mentioned it. It's because he's demonstrating that he's going to raise himself up from the curse God gave him. It made him to crawl on his belly before, diminished his power because he has plans for mankind, right? And he's this shining human being now. He's this God, and he's replaced his old image. He killed off his old image, and it's sort of an act of a phoenix that's going on there. He dies, and he's reborn as Apollo. So that's like one concept, but it's the same. There's dual meanings kind of there. He is actually planning to manifest on Earth.
Yeah.
In human form. And a lot of people, I'm not going to say the word, I'm just going to keep saying that Nachash is going to manifest in human form. But I'm not going to say the word. It's almost become cliche now, you know. People say, oh, Christians are crazy. They think this powerful evil person is coming, and well, that's right, he is. But so at Delphi, the virgin priestesses uttered oracles, and the root of Nachash is to do that type of thing, to utter prophecy, or to tell man's future. And it was sort of an apt thing for the virgin priestesses to do, is tell the future of man for the Nachash in the light. I mean, it's coming from his influence. What's going to happen to you? Well, speak to the snake through the woman. Again, an amalgamation of the woman, the snake, and that keeps going on. it keeps getting recapitulated in myth in different forms. You know, you don't necessarily have a snake. You may have the sun allegory or the stars or that type of thing, and the woman. But always the woman's there somehow, or you'll have a woman goddess or a monster that has the body, the upper body of a woman, and the lower parts of a snake, like Echidna. So another story that's very similar to Apollo going to Delphi is the story of St. George. The Masons love St. George. St. George is a patron saint of the Masons. So St. George, if you go to a book called The Golden Legend, written by a Jacobus de Voragine in 1260, it tells a story of the town of Selene, which means flame. Selene means flame or to burn. And they had a dragon problem. And they had to feed this dragon every day or every some certain period of time. And they fed it goats. And when they ran out, they had to feed the dragon their children, or the dragon would come and destroy their town. So they picked the children that were for the dragon by lottery. And so, of course, there's a king there, and he has a beautiful daughter. And one day, because they were a fair kingdom, his daughter, the princess, got chosen. So the king said, well, anybody that kills this dragon, and saves my daughter, I'll give half my kingdom to. And so anyway, they tied the princess up, and the dragon was going to get her, and then St. George walked by and asked her, what did she do, to have this punishment? And she said, just go and leave me, and you won't be bothered. He didn't listen to her. And the dragon came out. He had a special lance that he charmed the beast with, and he took the princess's girdle and wrapped it around the dragon, and she led it into town, and then he decapitated it. And the king was, of course, very happy, but St. George just left. And after that, the legend goes that the town was baptized. But that's an interesting story. Again, there's dual meanings in that as well. It's a parallel to the story of Apollo. You have the same idea, the Nachash coming and killing his old self. But in this case, St. George is there for a while doing it, and then he does something kind of eerie. He pacifies himself and saves a woman, right?
Right.
And then leaves. He doesn't take half the kingdom. He leaves as if maybe he's going to return.
Yeah.
It's kind of spooky, but the meaning it has, and this is sort of a lower level meaning, and I say, and I haven't talked about this either, but the Masons have colors that they refer to, and the Red Lodge is the Lodge of Understanding, and the Blue Lodge is the lodge that I think Albert Pike said it really well, is the lodge that the Masons are supposed to think they understand.
Oh, wow.
But they don't. So what this idea is with St. George is when the initiate or someone from the Blue Lodge understands who the dragon is and comes to the understanding of the dragon is not to be feared, that it is this light bringer, and that light bringer's been there all along helping us. And perhaps the initiate would believe finally that the people that believe in God, Christians, the Christian influence on their life up to that point wasn't quite giving them the whole truth. And now they finally got it. They understand that the seething powers of Lucifer, as Manly P. Hall would say, can be theirs. And some Masons, when they get to that point, the poor Masons, now have slayed their dragon. So from there, I wanted to talk about something that's very well illustrated, and it's illustrating that idea of the Nachash killing off his old form and rising up, and it's laid out in as clear as possible for people, but not a lot of people have looked at what I'm talking about, the image that I'm talking about, and they are able to understand what it's saying. I've seen a lot of different interpretations of it online, specifically some completely, absolutely wrong, ignorantly wrong, just kind of laughable, and others very well done, but they're missing a salient point, a certain core salient point. So the UN Security Council room mural that people have been talking about, I have up on my blog a little essay on it, but the Norwegian artist Per Lassen Krogh painted this back in, let's see, what was it, 65?
Yeah.
The date here, sometime around there, maybe earlier, and they put in the Security Council room as a gift. And when the first time I saw this, that must have been about a year ago. I stared at it a long time. I just couldn't believe what I was seeing. You know, what it proves to me is what I'm talking about isn't something that's really that well hidden. It's meant to be out there for people to at least perceive and not understand. But the high-level Freemasons, the alchemists, the neo-alchemists that are out there, this is their great hope. And they really believe this, as earnestly as any person of any religion believes in their deity. I gotta hand it to a lot of the high-level Freemasons. I mean, they have absolute faith in their lower G God. But anyway, whereas a lot of Christians are fairly lukewarm.
Yeah.
Maybe not so many, but I'm seeing that a lot now. It's anything's okay. No.
Yeah.
Anything is not okay. But the way this picture depicts the Nachash is pretty much what I've described already in the story of Apollo going to Delphi and St. John. You have the chthonic dragon here wrapped up in a gray death state with the sword it slew itself with in its own mouth still. So obviously this bottom portion here, when you're seeing this dragon, the dragon's killed itself, and it's underground. You can see it's in a cave. And there's all these human figures that are kind of emerging alongside of him. And just above him, of course, you have this phoenix with its sort of a shell beneath it. And that is standing in front of this background of golden stars with this sort of darker blue background. And the people that are coming out of the ground here are going into that portal, the Asterion. So you have, the starry one, you have that concept accentuated here, the Asterion, right behind the phoenix. The double meaning there, right there in front of you. And then I noticed the circle that you have here. You'll have a brighter outside, the way the artist did this. And then he changed sort of subtly the coloring and the shading here so that there was a circle that's around this mandorla, this almond-shaped center. And the idea, the circle, is a symbol for Apollo. You'll see a circumpunt. The Masons use it a lot, a dot with a circle around it, symbolizing the sun, or Apollo. It won't say Apollo. But notice where the center of the circle is, it's right above little baby's head, which in turn is right above the head of the phoenix. Like, who's that?
Oh, wow, yeah.
I wonder. And still, if you're not understanding the story well, you look up a little bit higher, and then they have the Pan-like figure in the branches there, distributing his Cydonia fruit out to the little girl there next to him, who's
Wow,
happily
yeah.
receiving it. That is in the UN Security Council room, and of course, behind them, I'm looking at the pictures, kind of small on my screen. You have the festival. Everybody's enjoying themselves, and the people sort of that are joining the festival are being released from their bonds, their slavery that they were in. And you know, of course, the attitude about whoever painted this, who he would think was the oppressor here.
Right.
So, I mean, it's really obvious that people have this information about what the Nachash has planned for mankind, even in buildings like the UN, and they're not perceiving it. It's done. It's put there, right there, in front of them, and they still can't see. If they read their mythology, though, and they can now, it's all out there for free. They may start getting a better idea of what this is all about. I come out and really say exactly what's going on there. But I guess the best way to start is just at the beginning. The myth is that King Minos wanted to be a very powerful king, so he prayed to Poseidon. Grant me power, and Poseidon in turn sent him the Cretan bull, which is Zeus in his bull form, the beautiful white bull, and King Minos really liked the bull, thought it was so pretty, he didn't want to kill it, so he didn't, and instead he killed one of his own, and this made Poseidon very angry, and so to punish King Minos, he made his wife Queen what was her name? Let's see, it's Pasiphae, I think it's pronounced Pasiphae, which means wide shining. Again, this woman's name in myth, something to do with being able to see, her eyes are open. And he caused her to fall in lust with the bull. And so she had Daedalus, the clever worker, fashion her a wooden bull. And that's how the Minotaur was conceived. And at first the Minotaur was barely controllable, but then King Minos again went to Daedalus and asked him to create a trap for him, something to contain the Minotaur in. And so he did. And the Minotaur required humans. It was hungry for human flesh. And I think Minos did something. He was at war with Athens, but he made a deal with them so that, and I can't remember exactly the reason they were at war, nor it's not really important right now to go into that, but they had to sacrifice their kids, their children. They had to pick them and give them to the Minotaur. And once you went into the maze, there was just no way out. Yet, once you went into the maze, you always found the Minotaur. The Minotaur always found you. And so they were tired of doing that, sacrificing their kids to it, just causing too much pain for that part of the country. And the idea is pretty much lost on people what the Minotaur represents and what the Labyrinth represents. And got to understand that now that I've gone over the idea of what the bull is, you have a fairly clear path to what the meaning could be. You have Zeus, again, and you have the woman, and you have this man and bull being made out of their union. So let's see, going back a little bit though, the person that killed the Minotaur, his name was Theseus, and he did a strange thing though before he went into the labyrinth to get the Minotaur. He went to Marathon, and people hear that name a lot, but it actually means fennel. And the interesting thing about fennel was the giant fennel, which Marathon was named after because it had so many. It was overgrown with fennel stalks. Giant fennel was what Prometheus stole fire. He hid it in a big giant fennel stalk when he stole the fire and gave it to man.
Oh, wow.
So you have the implement of taking knowledge, this idea, and you have Theseus going to Marathon, and what did he find there? He found the Cretan bull, and he took the bull back to Athens and he sacrificed it. So this act is very strange if you're going to assign core identities like I was talking about before, but just the easiest way that I understand it is he's doing the same type of act that Mithras is doing in the Tauroctony. He is murdering the bull. It's like this foreshadowing of what he's going to do later. Then he goes into the labyrinth and he finds the Minotaur, and he has help coming out. He has the clue that was given to him by, I won't go into her name and meaning right now, but he had help from, I think, a daughter of King Minos. And he killed the Minotaur and he escaped. And everything was good after that. He was a hero. Simply put, what you have is an image of Christ as the Minotaur there.
Yeah.
And you have someone that first dispatches the one God, or in other words, becomes an enemy of God, murdering him in a sense, that sort of ritualistic sense. Now they're an enemy of God. They go into the trap that was laid by God, in a sense, himself, is what the Nachash is saying, and also with his help, because, of course, Daedalus is the clever worker that made it and trapped this man-god. Man, God, son of man, son of God. You kind of are getting to the idea, I'm sure, of what I'm saying. So Christ died in the labyrinth. He's no problem anymore. It's really another diabolical understanding of what that story means. And it's a really huge story as far as the ancients, the Greeks really, and of course the Minoans, really are fixated on it. And so, well, I mean, everybody to this day are fixated on it. And it's in architecture as well. If you look around at temples, they'll have this thing called Greek key, the zigzag line. And now there's more to it as well. But I'll just sort of leave it there, that he's going in there and he's killing the one God. And there's a replacement. There used to be coins that they found, I think, in Crete, the Minoans made, and there'd be a labyrinth on one side and a Minotaur's head, and you turn it over, the labyrinth would be on the other side as well, but there'd be a star.
Oh, wow.
And people study mythology say, well, the Minotaur and Asterion are the same. The Minotaur was Asterion and vice versa. And I say that, well, not necessarily. What happened when Theseus went in there and killed the Minotaur was that now it's that area, which is our world. We live in the labyrinth. Our world's now been replaced by Asterion. Then the influence of that creature now has taken hold, because he's done away with the influence of God. Of course, that's completely ridiculous, but that's what that story is talking about, as far as people that look at it in the light of how the Nachash looks at our world. And the Masons, too, look at it the same way. Back up a second to talk about the fennel stalks. The cult of Dionysus and Bacchus used to hold fennel stalks, and they put a pine cone at the top, at the tip of it. It was called the thyrsus, and they'd wrap it in ivy, and they'd put honey on it, and they carry it out in front. It was a symbol of their god. Thyrsus. In fact, I went to Helena, the capital of Montana, and I looked at their Capitol building. They have a really ornate building for the state at the time. Well, there are actually a lot of millionaires living there when they become a state. But the Copper Dome has some very nice representations of the thyrsus on the sides, next to
Oh, wow.
round windows made, with ivy. But getting back to the Masons, they have a thing in almost. Again, I haven't been in a Masonic hall, but every picture I've looked at, everyone has tile, the black and white tile on the ground, and they call it the mosaic pavement. And what that is a symbol of is the labyrinth that we live in. And you'll never see the Minotaur head inside of or in the center of that, ever. You'll always see the star. The blazing star, they say, inside the mosaic pavement. A lot of the time, if they illustrate it in their writings or their artwork, you'll see roses around that. But if you see the black and white Masonic tile, think of the labyrinth. Think of what they're saying. They're saying this is this world, this complex trap that somehow God put us in, and our Savior went in and dispatched him and made it possible that we can see the light. Now we can escape. That's the most succinct way I can say what that is all about. But I go into it way more extensively in the book. There's a point that is important for people to understand, and that is in paradise, there's no need to struggle for one's existence. You just do happily in peace and harmony and joy in the presence of God. And God, after God left their presence, Adam and Eve's presence, then there is now the requirement for them to labor, to live until they die, right? And when there's more human beings on the earth, they find that they can't do everything that they would like to do in their pursuit of happiness, whatever they're having to do, raising families, and they find that others who live around them, their labor can help them, and vice versa. And there just needed to be some type of way to exchange this portion of their life that they were doing, right? The quintessential idea is that you live a very set amount of time while you're alive. You're living through time. We're stuck in this linear time. And so when we're laboring in time, that's time that we're never going to get back, that we're devoting to now the production of this unit of exchange, this exchange item that people call money, that concept, right? So what better unit of exchange is something, other than something that doesn't degrade over time? And precious metals like gold, that is a perfect example. It doesn't degrade over time. It's a product of things outside of the Earth, supernova, fusion reactions that occurred in the universe that are still here. And the silver isn't as good a unit of exchange. It does tarnish, but it is also used. So silver and gold were the base units. And gold especially, though, is you got to understand that the fruit of the knowledge of the tree was very golden. And the idea of what that fruit was goes back to a lot of the work my brother did, talking about Pyrrhosidonia, the scientific name of the fruit of the tree, or the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. And if you look at the quince, you'll find that it is indeed very yellow, very golden. And so the necessity of money came from that, from the Garden of Eden. Again, that focal point that the Masons are fixated on, and so is mythology. It all originates from there. And the Nachash is fixed on it as well. But that pyros, that fiery Cydonia fruit, and my brother talked a lot about Cydonia. I mean, in Cydonia, the Secret Chronicles of Mars wrote so much about it. I won't talk about that, but the important thing I need to say, though, is the quince itself came from the word coin, from the Old English coin or the Old French coin. And I have an example of some usage of that, calling the quince a coin. And the interesting thing about that word, that etymology, is that it grew from the idea of the separation, again, the pillars, that wedge being placed between man and God. I mean, so how perfect is it that now a man or a woman works and they say to each other, I have this coin, this thing that actually looks like the Pyrrhus Cydonia, right? That caused
Yeah.
all this problem. And they exchange it. There's a bit of my life because of what happened in Eden. And you accept it and give them what they need to live. It's a really basic idea. And there's other people that are talking, well, very few others that are talking about it. Specifically a woman named Anne Barnhart, I believe is her name. The one who burned some bacon on a Quran. She became famous for that. The Latin cunis, or cuneus, means a wedge, and the Old French coin from the Latin cunis can mean a wedge or a stamp, a piece of money, or a corner or an angle. So the idea of stamping money or taking like a sledge and actually smashing a piece of gold, it's very malleable, so it forms to whatever the die is. Even that act, that putting it on a wedge and coining, this is the same word. That word can also mean an exterior angle or wall or other piece of masonry, or a nook, or in the modern French, an interior angle. And from that idea to that word cuneiform, describing the earliest known form of written language or written expression in Sumeria.
Right. Yeah.
That word coin is very, very profound. So I think it'd be interesting, if you do any type of, commerce, or there's a lot of people do accept gold right now, they happily accept it, and you give them a $20 gold piece or whatever it is, and you look at them afterwards and you say, why are we doing this? But from the idea of a wedge between man and God, and the symbol of what money is, I think the quintessential goddess that personifies this is a goddess named Hecate or Hecate, and the Wiccans are into worshiping Hecate. And I have a picture that probably will appear here now, and it's very peculiar. This is the picture of the triple Hecate, and she's actually been built into an angle, a corner angle. It's emerging out of the side of her body. She's wearing on each of her three heads a Phrygian cap, and she has the solar rays coming out of her head. And the etymology of Hecate is interesting. It's Greek, and it's an epithet of Artemis, which is the feminine form, the equivalent feminine form of Hekatos, which in turn is an obscure name for Apollo. It means far shooting, which is another name for Athena, the far shooter, the one that had the ability to destroy from a distance, maybe the goddess of war. She's specifically associated with commerce, and the Greeks used to pray to her, and as well as the Romans, for good luck in making money. And if it's said that if she receives those type of prayers favorably, that you will be granted money. He will become rich. So they'd have statues of Hecate built into their businesses. And it's interesting because the Muslims and the association with Isis and Hecate, and the reason the Muslim flag looks like it does. And I won't get into that story, but it's in the book, and it fits very well. And it's the irony of the ISIS phenomenon right now.
Right,
And
yeah.
the irony of it going on right around the city of Nineveh is very interesting to me. But going on from there, continue with that concept of money. Our United States really did understand the essence of money back when it was established. And the founding fathers that people say were very devout and Christian, I can't really argue with that. I mean, it's to say that they were anything but that to most people is sacrilege. I mean, how can you? That is anti-American, and you're a terrorist or whatever the modern thing is now. They call people that say things that denigrate the founding fathers. But I'm not doing that. I'm being someone who thinks freely and thinks, I believe, rationally, and then looks at the whole picture. And what I see there are, I see that they were high-level Freemasons, many of them. And if that is the case, and they were acting on what Sir Francis Bacon and John Dee were excited about, right? Establishing the New World for a very peculiar and particular purpose, as Manly P. Hall said. They knew exactly what they were doing. They were operating in a hermetic fashion. And this is complex. And this is difficult for a lot of people to understand. And this is very Nachashian sort of game that's being played. What they do is they establish the United States. They establish something first under the law of God, the facade that they are holy. Of course, you can't join a Masonic fraternity unless you believe in a creator. Then maybe they were understanding Christians, or Christians that did really have love for their God, had love for Christ, right? And maybe that changeover happened later, or maybe they never had. I don't know, but they were high-level Masons, and they did establish this country under, basically, if you go back, their Judeo-Christian values. It's almost as if that it's done so that Satan, right, the Nachash serpent, can say, well, look at how this nation was established under your law, and look what happened. Look how it didn't work.
Yeah.
Which is ridiculous, but it's MO, the mode to do it, to get it to this point that we're at right now. And as if to prove, that Nachash is trying to do it, that God has, one God doesn't have it under control somehow. Manly P. Hall, I think I'll read this by him. It's from The Secret Teaching of All Ages that he wrote in 1928. And he said the European mysticism was not dead at the time the United States of America was founded. The hand of the mysteries controlled in the establishment of the new government, for the signature of the mysteries may still be seen in the Great Seal of the United States of America. Not only were many of the founders of the United States government Masons, but they received aid from a secret and august body existing in Europe, which helped them to establish this country for a peculiar and particular purpose, known only to the initiated few. So, the idea that the Freemasons were establishing this nation under God, it wasn't quite the way that they were planning. They were excited about the establishment of this nation, but for that peculiar and particular purpose, that was the goal. And what that peculiar purpose is, if you tell someone they'll look at you like you're crazy. But
Right. Yeah.
after you're done reading my book, maybe you'll believe what their purpose is a little bit more. Or if you didn't have any idea, you'll definitely believe. Maybe if you didn't have any idea, it may work on you. If you did have an idea, I think you'll definitely understand and believe that it's going to occur. I believe it's going to occur eventually. I don't believe that the United States is going to get any better before it gets any worse. Anyway, at the beginning, there are documents that stated, that they understood the essence of money, that the debasement of the coinage that they're making, that the United States, the people of the United States were in control over, was an act of murder, because they're tokens of human life. If someone is debasing them, they're taking life in a different way, but it's taking human life nonetheless. And the penalty on debasing coins, Section 19, says that if anybody's guilty of that type of offense, they shall suffer death if they're found guilty of embezzlement or fraudulent. I mean, if they're doing any of that, they die.
Wow.
And I think that's maybe a little bit severe, but they
Yeah.
understood the essence of money back then. They don't anymore. We're under the control of the Nachashian system of commerce,
Yeah.
and it's controlled by as Manly P. Hall said, an august group, a very elite and not very large group, who have as their big crime boss, or the big Yakuza boss at the top, Nachash himself. But the thing that's going on now with our currency is that it's a talisman. And a talisman, the word tala just means to consecrate. And that's because when a magician would make it, or an alchemist would make the magical item, they had to wait till the time was right. The stars were aligned correctly, and the planets were in the correct positions, and there was the correct season, and they invoked the correct god or goddess to instill the power into it. And they had to understand what that power was, how to use it, and how to direct that power over another individual. And the power of the talisman is all dependent on the way it's made, of course, as I have said, but also the way it looks, the symbol of it. And excellent example of a talisman is the Great Seal of the United States. And of course, I have an old silver certificate. When I was little, I think my dad had a couple in an encyclopedia, and he actually showed one to me before I could understand really what he was saying. He said, "You can exchange this for silver. It's not like what you have in your hand." And that's how money really got started. This paper money. You don't want to be carrying that heavy metal around, right? So give it to us. We'll keep it in the vault for you, right? And we'll exchange. We'll give you these light pieces of paper. Yeah, I guess before I start saying anything about that, but the power of the talisman needs to be directed over people by people that understand its power and that have some part in the creation of it. So the dollars that we have right now are nothing more than that magic controlling the whole earth right now. How that came about is quite interesting, but I'll go into the dollar right now. The word dollar comes from Saint Joaquin Taller, the Valley of Joaquin, or Saint Joaquin, and there's a big silver strike there, and they started minting a lot of silver pieces, and they shortened the name so that they were just called tailors. And tailor sort of sounds like dollar. That's where that came from. But the first currency was known as a dollar in the U.S. Well, were the pesos, or the pieces of 8, and they were named pieces of 8 because they were worth 8 Spanish reals or royals, and they were minted starting after the currency reform of 1497 that was instituted by King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, same people that funded Christopher Columbus and Pinta Nina and Santa Maria Marina. And the peso became the first world currency in the late 1700s, and they were used in the United States, or the New World, until the Coinage Act here in 1857, which outlawed the use of the pieces of 8 as legal tender. We had to start minting our own. And the Americans called the pieces of 8, though, up to that time, pillar dollars, because they had 2 pillars on the front side, I believe. And these were a depiction of the pillars of Hercules. And people knew what these were because Sir Francis Bacon had put them at the front of his new book that was called the New Instrument, or the Novum Organum, and I think that was published in 1620. And I think I said before also that Francis Bacon was a very high-level Freemason.
Yeah.
He was of the Rosicrucian Masonic order. He along with John Dee, I think, were very two of the most influential Masons in Europe who ever lived. But they were both very pro starting the new world. It was almost as if they knew that something great would happen, which is very diabolical. Not something, of course, that they knew that would happen even in their lifetime or even generations later. I mean, it'd be way down the road. But that idea of pillars and money still accentuate the idea of where money came from, the need for money, the garden, and the separation event, that wedge idea. And you will actually see the pillar, you actually could see the pillar in the silver certificate, I think, that were issued from 1928 to 1957. They had pillars on both ends of the dollar bill on the front where the one was, and they took those away eventually, but you saw that even on the dollar, and that was at a time when you could still exchange a dollar for the amount written on it for silver. And the power of the talisman was added to the dollar in a very sneaky fashion. The Great Seal was added in 1935 by Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Again, he was a Freemason, and I'm sure people know that. I think Roosevelt means Field of Roses, which is a very hermetic meaning for the name of a president. But in 1964, the dollar was just simply no longer redeemable. I mean, you could not get the same amount of silver for it. Now, it was completely, people relied on this money, this currency that they made, this nothingness, this magic talisman. It had the full power of the talisman. Now people exchanged it for the same type of things they used to, for the ones that were exchangeable for the precious metal that they represented, and that's taken away completely, and they still operate in the same fashion. But now that gives the private entity controlled by the august few elite the power to do whatever they want. They can print as many of these talisman as they want and murder men on a scale unbefore seen in history, but people don't even realize it. When they're inflating your money, they're murdering you and your family and your children, and their children, and people are fine with it. Ask someone if, throw these concepts at someone and they'll scoff. but ask them the question, why hasn't the $1 bill been radically altered in its appearance? You don't want to affect the magic. You don't want to alter the effect of the talisman because that power is being directed over you. It's controlling you. You're spending your finite amount of life working for it, for them. They have it has control.
Yeah.
And it's only going to get more severe until we come to the chaos that we're needing here. It's going to eventually get to. But it leads to sort of the beginning of this idea of the eradication of the way commerce is carried out. People say, well, I mean, that will never happen. We go to a barter economy or whatever. Well, first you need a great amount of control over the whole world, and that's occurring more quickly than people realize. And you need a calamity, you need chaos, and you need people to look up for somebody to save them.
Yeah.
And say, we'll give up all our freedom for the safety that you provide. You see that happening all over and over and over again, but it's going to happen in a really huge, stepped up fashion. And then commerce will be eliminated, and where not necessarily eliminated, but there'll be a new form of it that depends on worship of the Nachash exclusively, and always a fixation or a remembrance of who he is and what he did for man at that period of time when the old way is done. You know, he's put his paradise on earth. So I'm digressing again. But what I wanted to get to is that idea that the pillars and commerce and money are embodied in the Twin Towers. And when they collapsed, it was a beginning of a new era where the Nachashian plan was being set into motion. I don't think people think of that event in this way at all.
Right.
But if you're understanding what the pillar symbolism is, and how it's related to how commerce is carried out right now, it will seem fairly obvious, I think. A peculiarity of Twin Towers was that it was made by a guy who tried to imitate it artistically as Mecca, to make it look like Mecca.
Wow.
His name was Yamazaki. He died in '86, and so he tried to make the tower area and the place between it look like that big foyer where the Kaaba stone is in Mecca, and the Kaaba container, the big black container for the Kaaba. And at the center, he commissioned this German artist or sculptor, where there was going to be a big fountain before, when they were making this back in the early 70s. I think it was the early 70s. And the German artist, I think his name was Fritz Koenig, he made a big, huge, spherical, sort of brass, golden, sectioned sculpture. It looked sort of like there was a man underneath it, holding it, and the name of it was the Spherical Caryatid. He called it the Great Spherical Caryatid. And again, even the art that was at the Twin Towers had this idea of pillars. A caryatid is a female pillar, and it comes from the Greek caryatid, name for maiden that lived in the ancient town of Caryatid. The male counterpart for a female pillar, or a pillar made with a female, like, goddess, is an Atlas. Obviously,
Oh wow. Yeah.
himself. There's a male god. It's an Atlas. A place where you could see like the quintessential caryatid is the Temple of Hathor. The temple was at Dendra, the Dendra complex in Upper Egypt, and I think I have a picture of that too. The Hathor caryatids, or divine pillars, are a big feature of that, and that's what that idea is. The spherical caryatid, again, was the only thing that wasn't destroyed, I guess, well, it was one of the things that wasn't destroyed completely. It was damaged, and it was moved somewhere else. And the artist called it a beautiful corpse. It's just this foreshadowing. It's sort of a prophecy that the Nachash is seeking to unite heaven and earth, but of course his heaven isn't what we think heaven is. It's going to be his final manifestation and control, and things will be better, right, for a time. But you know the story, how the story ends. He's coming as a human. He's going to have complete control, even more control than he has right now, if that is possible. And mathematically speaking, the eventuality of a complete, absolute, catastrophic collapse of the United States and world economy is obviously going to happen. Exactly when it happens, I think fairly soon. Fairly soon. What does that mean? I definitely won't mention dates. I think there's a symbol that the Nakashians, the neo-alchemists, the high-level Freemasons hold near and dear to their heart, that happens to be on our dollar bill, that has something to say about it. Yeah, I think a lot of people have gotten to the point where they're just hungry to hear some truth, because they are just tired of the satanic propaganda that they've been given since they've been born. Like, I think you mentioned, you're born into this. You just think it's just the way things are, but it's not the way things are. And I want people to know that. And until people understand that, there's nothing we really can do about it. Sort of that being said, I don't think there's any way that this is going to be averted, this collapse or this evil sort of control over man as chaos builds. But we all know how it ends. So that's my take on it. Tell everybody who's willing to listen the truth. Tell them the most important thing they need to know, which is get to know Jesus.
Absolutely.
Get to know him. That will help out a lot, tremendously. Speaking of life, and I guess know your enemies is something that's probably helpful. You have an idea what's going on, so then maybe there's less fear as it's going on. There's understanding. You can tell other people as well.
If people want to know more about you or order your book, where can they go?
To my website, markaflynn.com, or Watch Your Vault, or they can find the book on a search on Amazon.com, or they can go to Raiders News Update and find it there too.
Yeah, all that being said, this is The Sharpening, and I am your host, Josh Peck. And as always, take care. God bless.